In a recent video, I discussed the similarities Stephenie Meyer and her Twilight books shared with that of author Sarah J. Maas. But in today's video, I plan to compare Meyer's story to one from the past. I've noted on this channel that Meyer took inspiration from classic literature, but one book in particular shares many of its tropes with Twilight. That book is Pride and Prejudice, a story which is so popular that it continues to be adapted into films again and again, and one which is still widely read by passionate bookworms. Twilight itself is receiving another adaptation, but it's likely Twilight owes much of its endurance to the classic it modeled itself after, and in today's video I'll be breaking down 7 similarities Twilight shares with Pride and Prejudice. For better or worse, Twilight has taken several elements from Austen's novel, which undoubtedly contributed to Twilight's success. As Pride and Prejudice continued place in the pop culture, canon attests to the timelessness of its themes, ideas, and plot twists. The most obvious similarity between Twilight and Pride and Prejudice is their use of the enemies to lovers trope. Austen can be credited with giving us many of the tropes we still love today, with the enemies to lovers, though it wasn't called that back then, being an especial hit. When Elizabeth first meets Darcy, the former comes away with a keen prejudice against Darcy for his improper comments and poor behavior. As she continues to see him, she finds him pretentious and aloof. Bella, likewise, is initially irritated with Edward. As Edward, like Darcy, keeps apart from others, including Bella, Bella becomes annoyed with his behavior, and both women aren't afraid to question their future love interests. This trope is by no means unique to either book, but Austen pioneered it, and Meyer popularized much of what we still see in YA today. While other tropes have fallen out of favor, enemies to lovers continues to grip readers, helping to explain why both Twilight and Pride and Prejudice are still sought after by readers. As for YouTube, it remains a classic trope to hit subscribe if you are enjoying this video. The second obvious commonality shared between the two books is that of the love triangle, a trope which, while still popular, has met with detractors in recent years. While I still believe in the trope, provided it's done well, we again have to thank Jane Austen for giving it to us. While Elizabeth attempts to put Darcy out of her mind, she is charmed by Wickham. Many begin to believe Elizabeth and Wickham will end up together, but with time and new information from Darcy, Elizabeth learns Wickham is a scoundrel. These potential second love interests, with their checkered past, are common to most of Austen's work, as we see with characters like Willoughby and Frank Churchill, though the ways in which they deceive differ slightly. Elizabeth never dreams of being with Darcy. Bella likewise comes to believe she will never be with Edward when he leaves her in New Moon, and she forms an attachment to Jacob. This occurrence would fuel months of debate for teen girls, as we argued back and forth between Team Jacob and Team Edward. Meyer again popularized the love triangle, the furor over Twilight's romances, leading to debates in other YA books like Team Gale versus Team Peeta. While some readers are burnt out on love triangles, given publishers' tendencies to shoehorn them in where they're not needed, this is another timeless trope which Meyer ultimately borrowed from Austen. Even the way Bella ends up relating to Jacob is unfortunately similar to how Elizabeth ends up relating to Wickham, but I'll address that in another point. The third element Meyer borrows from Jane Austen is the wealth gap. Neither Bella or Elizabeth are what you'd call poor. They both have good food to eat, and enough clothes to wear, setting them firmly in the middle class. However, they're not rich either, and they do have to stick to budgets. For Elizabeth, money is a great concern. While she wants to marry for love, she recognizes that their family could face financial difficulty, especially with her home being entailed to her cousin, Mr. Collins. As for Bella, she makes do with a sluggish computer and an old used truck, though, like Lizzie, she never feels any resentment over her budgetary limits. In order to attend college and have spending money, Bella has to work a part-time job, while Elizabeth and her sister Jane have to weigh wealth as one factor when searching for a husband. In penning her novel, even Austen seemed to say, "Love is most important, but wealth helps." After all, Elizabeth marries Darcy, who makes $10,000 a year, as much or more in that time as a lord made. As for Bella, her potential love interest can't hide his affluence. In looking at the clothes of the Collins, Bella notes that, despite their simplicity, they hint at designer origins. Most ostentatious are the Collins cars, as while they try and fail to blend in, they like vehicles that can go fast. Outside the town, Edward lives in what is essentially a mansion, and after marrying him, Bella learns that Carlisle owns a literal island. In both stories, our middle-class heroines fall in love with an extremely wealthy man, propelling her to riches she has never before dreamed of. It's a trope that remains popular in pop culture and fiction, with everything from 50 Shades of Grey to Pretty Woman utilizing it. But Twilight brought this trope back into vogue, and Austen again introduced it to readers. As for the fourth similarity, we have what I'll call the disinterested love interest. Edward and Darcy share similarities, especially as regards their behavior towards others. Both are aloof, keeping others at arm's length during social events, and it's not until they meet their future love interests that they learn to mingle more and interact with others. In the beginning of Pride and Prejudice, Darcy refuses to dance with anyone, with even the good-natured Bingley chiding him for standing about in such a stupid manner. Plenty of girls, as Lizzie notes, want for a partner, but Darcy won't budge. He finds Jane the only pretty girl in the room, and scandalizes Lizzie further by saying, unwittingly within her hearing, that she's not handsome enough to tempt me. In observing Darcy, Elizabeth finds him proud, and is certainly not convinced he's interested in her. Bella likewise believes Edward dislikes her. He never joins in any school events. His family eats apart from the rest of the students, and Edward disappears for days at a time, including the few days after he's met Bella. With his glares, Bella is sure he hates her, going so far as to suggest to him that he should have allowed the van to crush her so as to save himself regret. However, it becomes apparent to both Bella and Elizabeth that these antisocial men, clamored after by many without success, are actually in love with them. In wanting to acquaint himself with Lizzie, Darcy invites her to dance, while Edward takes Bella to the prom. Both men avoided social engagements prior, but their affections bring them out of their shells, and while their initial encounters with their love interests are rocky, things eventually work out. Of course, one of the pitfalls both Bella and Elizabeth face are opposition from family, including not only their own, but that of their love interest. When Lady Catherine de Bourgh catches wind of Darcy's interest in Lizzie, she goes directly to the Bennet home to vent her fury on an unsuspecting Elizabeth. As for Edward's family, they literally contemplate killing Bella, as her involvement with Edward means she knows too much, particularly if he doesn't mean to change her. Most of the Collins, thankfully, are disinclined to hurt Bella, as they respect human life. But Bella's dad also has his misgivings. As Bella runs away from home not once but twice as the result of Edward's involvement in her life, Charlie has cause to be wary, though he could never dream that his daughter is dating a vampire. When it comes to Elizabeth and Darcy, Mrs. Bennet also turns her nose up at Darcy after hearing how he treated her daughter. It's one of the moments in which I actually respect her, as no amount of wealth, even Darcy's, can soften the sting she feels when one of her children are maligned. Before long, the whole family takes an unfavorable opinion of Darcy, one Elizabeth is at pains to correct later. Her father is baffled when she announces her intentions to marry Darcy, but her father is willing to relent, provided Elizabeth loves him. Lizzie very nearly loses Darcy because of his opinion of her own family. In Bella's case, Edward is banned by Charlie from entering the house at first, finally being allowed to see Bella during designated visiting hours. Characters like Rosalie are still against taking Bella in, while Elizabeth faces the prospect of angering one of the most powerful women there is, Catherine de Bourgh. However, regardless of how their families feel, both couples end up together, with their respective parents coming to accept the decision. If there's one similarity between Twilight and Pride and Prejudice which hasn't aged so well, it's the underage elopement. As noted in my previous point, Elizabeth and Bella were involved in love triangles, with Wickham and Jacob respectively. Bella ultimately chose Edward, loving him more than she loved Jacob, while Elizabeth, on learning Wickham's true character, was careful to avoid him in the future. That said, neither Bella or Elizabeth escaped a relation to the men they turned down. In Elizabeth's case, Wickham pursued Lizzie's sister, Lydia, an affair which ended up in a rushed marriage. If Lydia being attached to a rake wasn't bad enough, though, there's the fact that Lydia herself is only 15, going on 16. By modern standards, she's only a teenager, and in the original book, she shows her age. However flirtatious she is, Lydia isn't mature for her years, even by today's standards, prancing about balls and rushing headlong into situations. That said, Austen's use of this plot twist has arguably, despite being written 200 years prior, aged better than its use in Twilight. For one, creepy as the relationship is, Lydia did have some say in it, though it's likely she'll regret her choice before long. Moreover, Lydia's attachment to Wickham isn't portrayed as a positive one. The elopement very nearly ruins the family, risking also Jane's attachment to Bingley, and it's hinted that Wickham has always liked younger girls, with him chasing Darcy's sister, Georgiana, when she was only 15. Nevertheless, unpleasant as the family finds Wickham, Lizzie must acknowledge him as her brother. In Twilight, though, Jacob doesn't just end up attached to someone who's underage. He imprints on a baby. While he, unlike Wickham, has no choice in the matter and doesn't feel actual attraction for her, the implication is clear. Eventually, the pair will end up together, and Renesmee seems to have little say in the matter. Primed to like Jacob from the start, and even gifted with a sort of promise ring when she's still a child, Renesmee's connection to Jacob has been likened by modern readers to child grooming. While I'm not going to debate the imprinting debacle here, it is interesting how this element is found in both books. Jacob's union with Renesmee is ultimately lauded as a good thing, though many readers find this plot twist weird at best and unhealthy at worst, while the attachment between Lydia and Wickham, conversely, is framed as a tragedy, with the Bennets only endorsing it because they have to make the best of things. Elizabeth, in watching her former love interest pursue an underage family member, is forced to call Wickham her brother-in-law, while Bella, with time, will have to call a man person she's made out with, her son-in-law. It's a strange twist in both books, but one they, for better or worse, share. Finally, the last similarity we have comes from that of the heroine's parents. Bella doesn't have sisters, but if we look at her mother and father, both are surprisingly similar, at least in temperament, to Lizzie's parents. While there are crucial differences, such as Renee being overly cautious about dating, while Mrs. Bennet pushes her daughters towards marriage, their demeanors are alike. To begin, we have the mother figure. Renee is seen as being flighty and erratic, careless and harebrained. Readers who read between the lines might even suggest that Bella was parentified, being forced to look after Renee as a little girl instead of the other way around. Having to keep track of the bills and manage the food in the house, Bella was forced to grow up prematurely. Though Bella notes that she loves her mother, she admits they have little in common. While young, Renee eloped with Charlie without thought. This rushed relationship resulted in a divorce when Bella was still a child. But while Renee learned a lesson from the experience, Mrs. Bennet remained trapped in her marriage, as in her time, divorce wasn't an option. While Renee could move on, Mrs. Bennet tragically ended up stuck with a husband that deep down couldn't respect her, something which bothers Elizabeth. Both mothers have a carelessness to them, with their daughters being comparatively quieter and more mature. Like Elizabeth, Bella takes more after her father. Charlie isn't bookish like Mr. Bennet, though both Lizzie and Bella become bookworms, but he's socially aloof. Mr. Bennet must be pushed by his wife to introduce himself to others. Charlie, likewise, has no more than two close friends, Billy and Harry, with whom he likes to fish. Spending his days alone by the TV or with a fishing rod in hand, he's not one for social gatherings, with Bella noting that neither she nor her father are verbose. Mr. Bennet's awkwardness is such that even Mr. Darcy, himself not great at events, remarks on it when listening to Elizabeth the issues presented by her foolish family, noting that even Mr. Bennet showed a lack of propriety. In leading Mary away from the piano, Mr. Bennet could have been more tactful. When it comes to Lydia being allowed to go to an event, which leads to her running off with Wickham, Mr. Bennet is also guilty. In different ways, both Bella and Elizabeth are more mature socially than their parents. Were Charlie and Renee forced to stay together and have more children, it's likely Bella's situation would have been much the same as Elizabeth's. She would have grown up watching her mother rush into situations, while her reserved father stumbled after her. There are differences, too, between Bella's parents and the Bennets, but it's still fun to see where their personalities overlap, and how such an upbringing shaped Elizabeth and Bella in similar ways, leading to both girls being more mature even than their parents, and fond of books when the antics of their families became too much. Twilight isn't a literary masterpiece, but what it borrows from Pride and Prejudice certainly helped it. In taking the best from Austen, Meyer gave her own book a timeless appeal, and both books remain widely read. That said, Pride and Prejudice isn't the only book from which Meyer took inspiration. In order to make Twilight stand out, Meyer also incorporated elements from other classics, which I discuss in the video on the left. Thank you for watching, and happy reading!